In late 2023, Minnesota outlet Alpha News released The Fall of Minneapolis, a documentary claiming that Derek Chauvin's trial was unjust and that George Floyd's cause of death is still an open question. Written and directed by Dr. J.C. Chaix, produced and based on a book written by Liz Collin, this crowd-funded documentary amassed a whopping 1.7 million YouTube views in less than 2 months. It's discussed positively, even in some left-wing spaces, especially in right-wing spaces, and gained large viewership on other platforms as well, so Alpha News' name recognition has increased substantially. The Fall of Minneapolis is also full of shameless lies. Not mistakes, not reasonable political disagreements, lies. I do not make this accusation lightly. If I've done my job well, by the end of this video series, you will agree that Alpha News created a piece of political propaganda so incomprehensible and misleading that there are only 2 possible explanations for their behavior. The first is that they're just lying. They propped up their claims by making up evidence, taking quotes out of context, ignoring the very trial they try to dispute, distorting crucial definitions or events, or even making outrageous claims and never expanding upon them. The other explanation, well, Alpha News makes a big deal throughout the course of this documentary to act like they're standing up for the truth. They act like truth tellers, showing the audience footage and arguments that the politicians and the media didn't want you to see. Their mission statement, on top of their About page, states, "We are a team of independent journalists with a mission of reporting stories that go untold by our state's mainstream media. Our dedication to uncovering the truth is persistent and unwavering." If they genuinely thought they did enough research and checked their claims enough before releasing this product, they are lying when they claim to be dedicated to the pursuit of truth. No responsible, competent journalist committed to the truth could have possibly released this product with the genuine belief that it had a factual basis for its claims. Maybe you fell for the lies in this documentary, and you're expecting to hate watch this video. That's fine. We've all been manipulated by misleading media. I know I have. People trust one another, and when Alpha News lies so brazenly about being committed to the truth, it can really disarm your critical thinking skills. I just ask that, like any decent person should, you remain open to the idea that you might be wrong and that your beliefs might need to be changed. Maybe I'm wrong about something. Let me know in the comments if you think so. I'm quickly going to address 2 common takeaways from the documentary. The first is shock about the full body cam footage of the encounter between George Floyd and the police before Chauvin murdered George Floyd. Alpha News presented this footage as something politicians and the media didn't want you to see. Many viewers expressed surprise and outrage that they hadn't seen this footage before, and seemed to feel like they were deceived in some way about the true events of the case because they hadn't seen this footage. However, this body cam footage was shown to the jury in full, and was published to the public on August 10th of 2020. Around 2 months after George Floyd was murdered. Judge Cahill, not politicians, not the media, initially withheld the footage from the public. His reasoning for doing so is clear, sound, and thoroughly explained here on the slide and in the article linked below. If you didn't see this footage, it's because you didn't want to see it, you didn't care to look for it, and that's fine. But the full footage was shown in the trial to the jury, and Chauvin was convicted nonetheless. The second common reaction, outrage about the riots. The riots were bad. They changed nothing about the details of the trial, and they do not support Alpha News' arguments that the trial was in any way rigged or mishandled. You can think the riots are bad. That doesn't mean you have to believe that this trial was unjust or that George Floyd deserved to die or died of a fentanyl overdose or whatever other garbage this documentary claims. The rest of this video is going to focus on the portion of the documentary that covers the trial of Derek Chauvin. The most important claim that they make to support their argument that Chauvin's trial was rigged is that the witnesses lied about the maximal restraint technique, or the MRT, and that evidence of MRT training was withheld from the jury. Here's a clip from the documentary where they show these supposed lies.
I'd like to show you what's been received as Exhibit 17. Is this a trained technique that's by the Minneapolis Police Department when you were overseeing the training unit?
It is not.
And how does this differ?
I don't know what kind of improvised position that is. So that's not what we train.
All right.
Yeah.
As you reflect on Exhibit 17, I must ask you, is this a trained Minneapolis Police Department defensive tactics technique?
It is not.
When I heard that part of the testimony, I really wanted to get up off my chair and yell, bullshit.
Several of those witnesses testified that MRT, or the maximal restraint technique, was not a part of Minneapolis police policy.
Oh, it wasn't part of the training. The pages that didn't want to be presented in court because they weren't in the manual. I've seen the manual. I've read through the manuals. I've seen them. They're not in the manuals? Well, they sure as hell are in Derek's training manuals. So how can they say that they don't exist?
That's Derek's manual.
These are Derek's training manuals.
And MRT is in there?
Yes, it's in there. So how can you say that's not part of the training? So the chief of police at that time told a frickin' lie.
Do you see how they sneakily defined the MRT as being what we see in this picture here? They try to say that the MRT is when you put your knee on somebody's neck, and they'll continue to define MRT in this way for the rest of the documentary. But they're just lying about this.
Your attorney wanted to show a photo of MRT to the jury, but Judge Cahill denied it. Was this a key piece of evidence?
I think it certainly is important. Just the fact that it's a PowerPoint training presentation that the City of Minneapolis Police Department delivered using that photograph that at least illustrates some of the training techniques that are performed.
Again, here's the implication that this photo shows the MRT. The photo shows a knee on neck restraint. That's not what the MRT is. We will see why in a second.
Were you trained in MRT, the maximal restraint technique?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yes, I was. Yes, we all were. Yes, all the police officers were trained in MRT.
Your police chief said on the stand that he didn't recognize that technique.
I heard him say that. It's tough to hear people lie, just straight lie. And again, goes right back to, for me, the good and the bad, like the right and the wrong. And for you to be under oath and just straight lie. The amount of training that we go through, I mean, it's consistent every single year. It's written down. It's on body cam. I mean, was that unfortunate? Absolutely. I know Derek Chauvin. It's absolutely horrific what happened, the whole scenario. But did he do anything intentionally to make that happen? No, it was all what we were trained on.
Let's recap. There was the compilation of all the officers saying, we were all trained on MRT, which they've already defined as a knee on neck restraint. Then you had that last officer saying, oh, it's so unfortunate what happened, but we were all trained to do this MRT, and that's when you put your knee on someone's neck for 9.5 minutes and keep it there even after your subject dies. Well, the MRT is not a knee on neck restraint, and I will show you why just using the documentary's own footage. Here's former officer Thomas Lane's description of their decision-making during George Floyd's murder. He describes that they decided to use the MRT. Only a couple sentences after the text Alpha News chose to highlight, Thomas Lane describes the MRT as putting a hobble on a subject's legs, not a knee on neck restraint. It's interesting that the 4 officers that played a part in murdering George Floyd decided not to use a hobble device, but still pinned him to the ground in the prone position for 9.5 minutes. If the MRT is indeed reliant on the use of a hobble device, well, then the officers weren't doing the MRT, were they? The funny thing is, we know what the MRT is, and what they're showing is not the MRT. They show the whole definition later in the documentary. Let's look at it now. Here are screenshots of the parts of the MRT policy they show. They show the whole thing, but they kind of blur through it. They don't highlight all the text, and of course, they don't want you to read the whole thing because it completely undermines their false definition of the MRT, so I will show you the full definition. Let's read from this policy and find out what the MRT really is. The purpose of this policy is to establish a policy on the use of hobble restraint devices and the method of transporting prisoners who have been handcuffed with a hobble restraint device. In other words, the policy that governs the MRT is to provide guidelines specifically for the use of hobble restraint devices. Next is the policy section, which says, the hobble restraint device may be used to carry out the MRT, consistent with training offered by the MPD on the use of the MRT and the use of force policy. The only context in which the MRT is described as an acceptable tactic is while using a hobble restraint device, and, importantly, while complying with the use of force policy. The definitions are next. Hobble restraint device. A device that limits the motion of a person by tethering both legs together. Rip Hobble is the only authorized brand to be used, not relevant, but, Maximal restraint technique. Technique used to secure a subject's feet to their waist in order to prevent the movement of legs and limit the possibility of property damage or injury to him, her, or others. Prone position. For the purposes of this policy, the term prone position means to lay a restrained subject face down on their chest. Side recovery position. Placing a restrained subject on their side in order to reduce pressure on his, her chest and facilitate breathing. So considering the policy says that the hobble restraint device may be used to carry out the MRT, and within the definition of MRT it says the technique used to secure a subject's feet to their waist in order to prevent the movement of legs, etc., I'd say that it's pretty impossible to imagine one can carry out the MRT in compliance with this policy without using a hobble restraint device. Here are a few other snippets from this policy that suggest this interpretation is correct. Rules Regulations A2. Using the hobble restraint device, the MRT is accomplished in the following manner. How about maximal restraint technique reporting? 3. When the maximal restraint technique is used, officers' report shall document the following. How the MRT was applied, listing the hobble restraint device as the implement used. This is my favorite because it clearly states that you should say how the MRT was applied, and you must list the hobble restraint as the implement used. You can't list anything else. If you're reporting the MRT, you have to list the hobble device, because within this policy, that is the only acceptable way to carry out the MRT. It's very clear. Of course, Liz Collin and J.C. Chaix can't really reconcile their narrative with this inconvenient fact, so they have to bend over backwards to dishonestly pull a ridiculous interpretation out of this policy that it's somehow ambiguous about what to do if you carry out the MRT without a hobble device. Here's J.C. Chaix making that argument in an interview.
You have to understand that there's a problem with that policy. It says if you use a hobble, you must put the person who is being restrained into what's called the side recovery position. An absolute utter failure of this policy is there is no part B that says what to do if you do not use a hobble, but still administer the maximum restraint technique MRT.
To be completely clear, not once in Policy 5-316 does it ever imply you can carry out the maximal restraint technique without the use of a hobble restraint device. Consider this comparison. Dr. J.C. Chaix reads a driver's manual. He finds the sentence, "If you drive a car, you must keep your eyes on the road." He then says, "There's an utter failure with this policy because it doesn't tell me what to do if I'm driving without a car." Just like you can't drive without a vehicle, you can't employ the maximal restraint technique in alignment with this policy without using a hobble restraint device. It's very clear. Read it again. So let's regroup. Not only do J.C. Chaix and Liz Collin falsely define the MRT as a knee-on-neck restraint, it's not, but they also are incredulously claiming that you can perform the maximal restraint technique without using a hobble device. You can't. Ridiculous as these positions might be, J.C. Chaix and Liz Collin are still accusing these witnesses of committing perjury.
Several of those witnesses testified that MRT, or the maximal restraint technique, was not a part of Minneapolis police policy.
Considering their false definition of MRT, this accusation seems unwise. But let's be charitable and take a second look at the trial footage Alpha News uses in the documentary to support their argument.
I'd like to show you what's been received as Exhibit 17. Is this a trained technique that's by the Minneapolis Police Department when you were overseeing the training unit?
It is not.
And how does this differ?
I don't know what kind of improvised position that is. So that's not what we train.
All right.
Yeah.
If one believes that the MRT is indeed what we see in Exhibit 17, it's not. The fact that Blackwell says she doesn't recognize the technique does indeed seem like a lie. Unfortunately for them, their definition of the MRT is so outlandishly dishonest that it's impossible to maintain while showing more than tiny fractions of the trial. Here's what I mean. Watch the full, unedited footage of the exchange between Katie Blackwell and the prosecution.
I'd like to show you what's been received as Exhibit 17. To ask you, officer, as you look at Exhibit 17, is this a trained technique that's by the Minneapolis Police Department when you were overseeing the training unit?
It is not.
And why not?
Well, use of force according to policy has to be, consistent with MPD training. And what we train are neck restraints, the conscious and unconscious neck restraint. So per policy, a neck restraint is compressing one or both sides of the neck using an arm or leg. But what we train is using one arm or two arm to do a neck restraint.
And how does this differ?
I don't know what kind of improvised position that is. So that's not what we train.
All right.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't that just shameless? They cut out the prosecutor asking, and why not? Why is this not a trained technique? And then Blackwell's entire explanation. Why would they need to be so obviously deceptive? Well, in the unedited testimony, Blackwell clearly and accurately describes Exhibit 17 as a neck restraint, not the maximal restraint technique, which obviously completely undermines both their false definition of MRT and the ridiculous accusation of perjury. Again, I ask, how can this editing choice be interpreted as anything other than deliberate dishonesty? Remember that Liz Collin said,
Several of those witnesses testified that MRT, or the maximal restraint technique, was not a part of Minneapolis police policy.
They deceptively edited Blackwell's testimony to make it seem like she said that, but with the full context, it's obvious that she did not say that. Let's see if they try to defame former Minneapolis Police Department Chief Arredondo in the same way they did Inspector Blackwell.
As you reflect on Exhibit 17, I must ask you, is this a trained Minneapolis Police Department defensive tactics technique?
It is not.
So the chief of police at that time told a freaking lie.
A frickin' lie, huh? Well, not quite. Sorry, Derek Chauvin's mom. It's not quite a frickin' lie. It's actually true. Because again, this is not what MRT is. MRT is not knee on neck. And Chief Arredondo is not referring to MRT in the clip Alpha News shows. Chief Arredondo actually does define MRT. Alpha News doesn't want you to see that because he uses the correct definition. I'll show you though. Here's that clip.
Can you describe what the maximal restraint technique is?
Yes, Counselor, the maximal restraint technique has often been referred to as the hobble. And that is it's a method of, if officers are dealing with typically a combative or aggressive person, in order to protect them or even property, it's placing, basically attaching a cord of the legs to the waist, so that the individual, does not have free movement of their legs. So it's securing them, again, usually by their ankles. If you're prone, bringing that up to your waist and securing it. The maximal restraint technique, or the hobble, though, if it's used, a supervisor has to respond to the scene. You cannot transport anyone prone in that position due to the risk of the breathing. But that is Counselor, that would be my understanding of the MRT, or the maximal restraint technique.
Again, we have a moment where either Alpha News didn't watch the trial and didn't see this, and thus committed journalistic malpractice when accusing people of perjuring themselves in the trial, which they didn't watch, or they're just lying. They saw this, and they ignored it because they wanted to define MRT in a different way that fit their narrative. That's been well established at this point, though, so let's look at the full context of the clip that Alpha News shows of this testimony. Arredondo talks for minutes about why Chauvin's actions were well outside of Minneapolis Police Department policy. Alpha News showed you 3 words. I will show you the rest.
First, I want to show you what's been received as Exhibit 17. Do you recognize Exhibit 17 to be an image taken from the bystander video that you reviewed?
Yes, I do.
Now, sir, based upon your review of all of the information that you just mentioned, do you believe that the defendant followed Departmental Policy 5-304 regarding de-escalation?
I absolutely do not agree with that.
And how so?
That action is not de-escalation. And when we talk about the framework of our sanctity of life, and when we talk about the principles and values that we have, that action goes contrary to what we're taught.
Here's what Alpha News put in the documentary.
As you reflect on Exhibit 17, I must ask you, is this a trained Minneapolis Police Department defensive tactics technique?
It is not.
Now back to the full clip.
Well, we read the departmental policy on neck restraints. Is this a neck restraint?
The conscious neck restraint by policy mentions light to moderate pressure. When I look at Exhibit 17, and when I look at the facial expression of Mr. Floyd, that does not appear in any way, shape, or form that is light to moderate pressure.
So is it your belief then that this particular form of restraint, if that's what we'll call it, in fact violates departmental policy?
I absolutely agree that violates our policy.
Are you aware now that the defendant maintained this position on George Floyd for 9 minutes and 29 seconds?
I am aware of that.
I believe you testified that force has to be reasonable when it's applied at the beginning and through the entire encounter. Is that right?
That is correct.
Is what you see in Exhibit 17, in your opinion, within Minneapolis Police Departmental Policy 5-300, authorizing the use of reasonable force?
It is not.
And why not?
That is it has to be objectively reasonable. We have to take into account the circumstances, information, the threat to the officer, the threat to others, and the severity of that. So that is not part of our policy. That is not what we teach, and that should be condoned.
When do you believe, or do you have a belief as to when this restraint, the restraint on the ground that you viewed, should have stopped?
Once Mr. Floyd, and this is based on my viewing of the videos, once Mr. Floyd had stopped resisting, and certainly once he was in distress and trying to verbalize that should have stopped. There's an initial reasonableness in trying to just get him under control in the first few seconds, but once there was no longer any resistance, and clearly Mr. Floyd was no longer responsive and even motionless, to continue to apply that level of force to a person proned out, handcuffed behind their back, that in no way, shape, or form is anything that is by policy, is not part of our training, and it is certainly not part of our ethics or our values.
Sir, based on your review of the video and based on your own experience and training as an MPD officer, did you see signs during the encounter that Mr. Floyd was exhibiting indicia of being in medical distress?
Yes. Yes.
And you saw at one point, I think you just testified that Mr. Floyd was unresponsive.
That is correct.
And that officers, were you aware that officers couldn't find a pulse?
Could you repeat that, sir?
And were you aware that officers at the time of the restraint were unable to find a pulse?
Yes, I was aware of that.
And so stated.
I was aware that the officers were not able to find a pulse, yes.
Did you see the defendant or any of the officers attempt to provide first aid to Mr. Floyd?
I did not see any of the defendants try to attempt to provide first aid to Mr. Floyd.
The defendant did not try CPR. He did not start chest compressions.
Sustain is leading. Rephrase.
Did you see them provide any medical attention?
I did not.
And based on Liz observations, do you have an opinion as to whether the defendant violated MPD Departmental Policy 7-350 by failing to render aid to Mr. Floyd?
I agree that the defendant violated our policy in terms of rendering aid.
Thank you. I have no further questions at this time, Your Honor. If you could please take me.
So now that I've described the ridiculous attempt to redefine the MRT and showed you the obscene, shameless, dishonest editing that we see in this documentary, I want to go back to the two possible explanations for this behavior. The first possible explanation is that J.C. Chaix and Liz Collin never read the policy defining MRT and didn't watch more than a couple minutes of the trial of Derek Chauvin, no more than the parts they showed in this documentary. If this is true, J.C. Chaix and Liz Collin have accused high-ranking police officers of lying under oath about a policy they themselves have not even read. Worse yet, they're indicting the entire American justice system, alleging a grand conspiracy to rig Chauvin's trial and produce a wrongful conviction without even watching the trial in question. If this first possibility is true, is this not journalistic malpractice of the highest degree? How could you possibly ever trust these people? How could you do this? If you were in their shoes, would you ever do such little research? I mean, this is like a chef not washing their hands. It's the most basic of the basics when it comes to journalism. But one of the only possibilities for this documentary's inaccuracy is that they just didn't do any research. The more likely possibility is that J.C. Chaix and Liz Collin did, in fact, read the full policy about MRT, did watch the full trial, but saw how thoroughly inconvenient it was to the narrative they wanted to push, and they lied. They lied about the information contained within these full pieces of evidence. They strategically picked tiny clips from hours of witness testimony and arranged them in a precise way to create completely different conversations than those that actually happened. And then they put them together to create the most compelling possible piece of dishonest political propaganda that met the desires of the audience that funded this documentary's creation. The lies they tell synergize perfectly. The false definition of MRT as a neon neck restraint is established. Then clips are cut up, rearranged, and taken out of context to deceive the viewer into believing that witnesses lied under oath about MRT being a part of MPD policy. This isn't an accident. This isn't Alpha News having a reasonable disagreement about the facts of the case. They are intentionally distorting the facts of the matter. The dishonesty, of course, doesn't stop here. The false definition of MRT is also used to legitimize another false claim, that evidence about the MRT was wrongfully withheld from the jury.
Your attorney wanted to show a photo of MRT to the jury, but Judge Cahill denied it. Was this a key piece of evidence?
I think it certainly is important. Just the fact that it's a PowerPoint training presentation that the City of Minneapolis Police Department delivered using that photograph that at least illustrates some of the training techniques that are performed.
Of course, this evidence regarding the MRT was not wrongfully withheld from the jury. J.C. Chaix and Liz Collin almost certainly know, A, that it wasn't wrongfully withheld, and B, exactly why it wasn't wrongfully withheld. You'll see why. The above slide shows a group of officers carrying out the MRT. They're using a hobble device to restrain somebody, and one of their knees happens to be on the upper shoulders of the arrestee. There are a lot of potential issues with this piece of evidence. A lot of them don't matter, so never mind the fact that Chauvin and company decided not to use a hobble device and thus were no longer employing the maximal restraint technique while maintaining an improvised neon neck restraint that forced George Floyd into the prone position for a dangerous amount of time. Never mind the fact that Arredondo testified to the fact that employing such a hold as a temporary means of halting a suspect's resistance is acceptable, and that departure from policy happened only when Chauvin failed to de-escalate immediately or noticed that George Floyd needed medical attention as he died slowly under his knee. Never mind the clear mandate on the above slide to place the subject in the recovery position immediately to avoid positional asphyxia, which of course Chauvin never did, or the even more prescient warning that sudden cardiac arrest typically occurs following a violent struggle. Alpha News pretends that the lack of a hobble device doesn't matter by fudging the definition of MRT, ignores Arredondo's testimony by only showing out-of-context snippets, and makes sure to obscure the text on the above slide whenever they decide to show it on the screen. Me walking through these damning facts and Alpha News dishonestly dismissing them, it doesn't matter at all, because this evidence was correctly withheld from the jury, and that's already a matter of law. Alpha News never mentions the incredibly inconvenient fact that the exclusion of the above slide was already disputed within Chauvin's appeal, and Chauvin's argument was dismantled by the court. On screen is the quote from the Court of Appeals, and you can decide whether this explanation makes sense for why this particular piece of evidence was excluded. This slide contains text describing the MRT and a photo of 3 men performing the MRT by restraining an individual in a prone position on the ground. Because Chauvin could not show that he received the training shown on this slide, the district court appropriately granted the state's motion to exclude the evidence for lack of foundation. Further, Chauvin cannot demonstrate that the exclusion of the slide prejudiced him. The text on the slide explicitly instructed the officers to place the subject in the recovery position to alleviate positional asphyxia when using MRT. As a result, even if admitted, the evidence would have further shown that Chauvin failed to follow the MPD training and used unreasonable force. Chauvin's argument fails. Alpha News claims in their mission statement that their dedication to uncovering the truth is persistent and unwavering. It seems obvious that an essential part of uncovering the truth about why this piece of evidence was excluded would be the Court of Appeals' opinion as to why it was excluded. If they could dispute that opinion, they surely would have. As it stands, the fact that Chauvin can't establish that he even saw this slide before he murdered George Floyd is a completely reasonable explanation for why it wasn't shown to the jury. Unfortunately, this fact is, again, incompatible with Alpha News' chosen narrative. So again, 2 possibilities emerge. Did they somehow miss the state's opinion about the denial of Chauvin's appeal? After all, they never mention that the exclusion of this slide was a part of the failed appeal, and they never engage with the arguments against the admittance of this evidence. Of course, missing this crucial argument against Chauvin's claims demonstrates an utter lack of journalistic due diligence and care for the truth. Surely they knew about the appeal and its failure. They even have Chauvin's appeal lawyer in the documentary, and, of course, Chauvin himself. No, they almost certainly lied, by omission, preserving their narrative but destroying any hope of adhering to their self-stated mission of uncovering the truth. The MRT slide wasn't the only piece of evidence that the Fall of Minneapolis claims was unjustly withheld from the jury. According to Alpha News, Judge Cahill refused evidence about the MRT, the miscommunication between the fire department and EMS, and Floyd's drug arrests. Throughout the Fall of Minneapolis, Alpha News makes claims that sound like a serious indictment of the trial's legitimacy, but collapse completely if one asks, well, why does that matter? So, why does it matter that Judge Cahill refused evidence about the miscommunication between the fire department and EMS? The miscommunication between fire and EMS was never a secret. It's thoroughly explained and freely discussed during the trial, and it changes nothing about whether Chauvin murdered Floyd. The evidence that the documentary refers to is body cam footage from one of the other officers in which it's mentioned offhand that there was a miscommunication. This changes nothing. If it mattered, they would say why it mattered, but it doesn't, so they don't. Floyd's arrest history is not relevant to whether he was murdered, and his struggle with opioid addiction is discussed freely during the trial, including by witnesses for the prosecution. So what evidence exactly was withheld and why did it matter? Well, they don't say, so I assume it doesn't matter. If they could point to particular incidents in Floyd's past that would have changed the facts of this case, or have made a solid argument whatsoever, they would have. But they can't, so they don't. They just drop something that sounds like it's suspicious, but they can't explain it because there's nothing there. It doesn't matter. It should be evident by this point that Alpha News is not interested in the truth. Methodically picking apart the layers of Alpha News' dishonesty, as I've done so far, is a painstaking process, and the marginal utility of such analysis diminishes quickly. In other, less obnoxious words, I will never be able to change the mind of a person who watches this video, reaches this point, and still believes a single word published by Alpha News. Any additional debunking of this documentary will not change any additional minds. I'm going to do a second video where I do a react-style debunking of the rest of the documentary, at least the parts that aren't just retelling of what happened with the riots. There's nothing new, just more lies, distortion, narrative pushing, and sickening journalistic malpractice. You should watch if you're interested or entertained by the most unimaginably ridiculous dishonesty. But if you're not, just ask any questions in the comments about any other parts of the documentary, and I'll answer them. I've been engulfed in this documentary, completely consumed by it for the past month or so. I know everything there is to know about every single garbage claim that they've made, and I'm happy to address anything within the documentary. So far, I've been thoroughly logical in my analysis. I'd like to end with something a little bit different. Liz Collin interviewed Derek Chauvin for this documentary. Much of the dishonesty and disinformation I've described came directly from his mouth and was left unchallenged by Liz Collin. This documentary, supposedly an investigation into the truth about this case, is in fact a platform for a convicted murderer to make the arguments contained within his already denied appeal. They never mention why the appeal was denied, or refer to the 50-page response from the court justifying the denial. They never once criticize Chauvin's actions or present an argument for his guilt. They never show the video of Chauvin slowly murdering George Floyd, or refer to the fact that Chauvin had a duty to de-escalate and provide medical attention, especially after the other officers told Chauvin that George Floyd no longer had a pulse. This documentary doesn't make an attempt to present both sides of an issue. There's no actual commitment to or care about finding the truth. This is more like a film produced to rehabilitate the public image of a celebrity embroiled in a scandal, with the sickening twist of Chauvin being the embattled star. Alpha News condemns and insults the mainstream media, but any mainstream outlet is better than this alternative media rag that's now best known for sacrificing any shred of journalistic integrity they may have possessed to produce a puff piece for Derek Chauvin. Like, subscribe, give me feedback, or ask any other questions about this horrible documentary in the comments. I watched it like 10 times, so I feel pretty confident debunking any claim they make. Yeah, thanks for watching. Bye.